number, but we're working on it.
Okay, does Ira have his phone number?
No, I do not. Not on hand, but I think everybody's playing the Zoom system, knowing the times.
Okay, so Jonathan, if it's okay, I think we can start with you first, and then hopefully Steve will join us while you're speaking. So, okay. So welcome back, everybody. I hope you had a good break. So now we're going to deal with issues of focusing more on the right side of anti-Semitism. And as Natan Sharansky says, and Haris Rafiq, who's here, always remind us there's a triple threat. We have anti-Semitism on the far left, political Islam, and right-wing anti-Semitism and racism and nationalism. So this session is focusing primarily on issues of the right. We're fortunate to have two leading scholars with us. The first speaker will be Professor Jonathan Wolff, who's the Alfred Landecker Professor of Values and Public Policy at the Bavladnik School of Government at the University of Oxford. And the title of his talk is The Lure of Fascism. And then we have Professor Steve Ross, who's the Dean's Professor of History and the Myron and Miriam Director of the Kasdan Institute for the Study of the Jewish Role in American Life. And he's at the University of Southern California in Los Angeles. So Jonathan, the floor is yours, and thank you very much for being here.
Thank you, Charles, and thank you so much for the invitation and for you all to listen to me. So I just need to put a few sort of confessions on the table. First of all, I'm not a scholar of anti-Semitism. I took my current chair, the Alfred Landecker chair, about 2 or 3 years ago. And part of that was to think about minority rights and the rise of authoritarianism in contemporary politics. But the chair is named for a gentleman who was murdered in the Holocaust. And that is also part of my own family history as well. And so as part of the work for the chair, what I've been doing is thinking about the parallels between society today and the 1930s. And so really that's where I'm starting. And also, of course, there are lack of parallels and lack of parallels between now and the 1930s. But I want to go back to a text that might be slightly surprising for this audience. And it's a work by T.S. Eliot from 1939 called The Idea of a Christian Society. And I mention this because I just happened to read it maybe 15 years ago. And there was something, the way he frames the situation which he's writing. So he's writing in around about March 1939. And he presents the world as one in which there are 3 ideologies that grip particularly Europe, but also the wider world. So one, of course, is fascism. Another is Soviet communism. And a third is liberal democracy, which he identifies with the US, the UK, and France. And his view early in 1939 is that it is not possible for these 3 ideologies to coexist in the world into the medium term, that these 3 ideologies will come into conflict as he saw them doing. And speaking from 1939, it was by no means clear which one of the 3 would prevail. So his prediction is that a few years after he was writing, the world would be led by fascism, communism, or liberal democracy. But it was impossible to tell in 1939 which one it would be. So that is a desperate thought. And I wouldn't want to say our own situation is directly parallel to that, but it is worth thinking about what are the dominant ideologies. And one thing that has struck me, actually, probably just in the last few months more than anything else, is in a way the lack of dominant ideology. So in 1939, people on the right could tell us that fascism would be our savior. People on the far left could write that communism would be our savior, and people slightly more moderate could think about that and see if they agreed or disagreed. But we don't have anything like that at the moment. We don't have a political ideology. With perhaps political Islam is offering it to some people, but for those for whom there's no appeal, we seem to be in an age where we have discontent, we have squabbling, we have disagreement, we have anti-Semitism, we have antagonism, but we don't have anything offering us a way out, particularly at the moment, or at least not to my mind. So I'd be very interested to know what others think about this. Some people say we are in the grip of neoliberalism. That may be true, but neoliberalism is not presenting itself as an ideology for the ordinary person, as a way of rescuing them from the situation that they're in. So what I want to do is to frame my main discussion around some themes from this remarkable book. I don't know if you can see this, whether Zoom is allowing you to see it. It's called What Hitler Wants, and the author is E.O. Lorimer. Now, this was published in late 1938. It's called a Penguin Special. And Penguin Special books, let me read from the back cover. Penguin and Pelican Specials are books of topical importance published within as short a time as possible from the receipt of the manuscript. Some are reprints of famous books brought up to date, but usually they are entirely new books published for the first time. So Penguin had this imprint to produce books within a few months of receiving the manuscript. That was as close as you got really to social media, I suppose, at that time. Rapid publication of books. I suppose that there were obviously magazines and radio. The book doesn't tell you who E.O. Lorimer is. E.O. Lorimer is Emily Lorimer. She was an Irish journalist, also a teacher at Somerville College, Oxford, a teacher of German. And she was her husband was part of the diplomatic corps, and she was an expert Germanist. And she had read Mein Kampf, both in German and in the English translation, and she was appalled at what she saw. So the German version had already circulated very widely. Every newly married couple was given a copy. There are 4 million copies of Mein Kampf in circulation in Germany. And a heavily edited translation had been produced in England that left out some of the most radical and disturbing parts of Mein Kampf. So, for example, the parts where Hitler lays out his plans to invade England were left out of the English translation, quite understandably. And some of the other parts that were most virulently anti-Semitic were also left out. So there are people who are reading Mein Kampf and thinking this isn't so bad. This is perhaps something that we might follow or adopt. Lorimer realized that so few people in England at that time read German that, as she says, the book may as well have been written in secret code. So even though there were 4 million copies in circulation, almost no one in England had read the German version, and they were not aware of the contents. So she wrote this book called What Hitler Wants, just to summarize what she thought the main ideas of Mein Kampf were, and the main ideas that were leading the Nazis. And I'm sorry, I don't know if you can hear an ice cream van in the background. Yeah, but anyway, it's not too bad a sound compared to what else you might be hearing from the school next door that I live to. Lorimer suggests that there are 3 main ideas that she associated with the Nazis and with Hitler in particular. One of them, you will have no surprises. It's a very crude form of nationalism, an emphasis on purity and othering, particularly, of course, othering of the Jews. So the anti-Semitism was absolutely a critical part of the Nazi mentality, as you all know. Secondly, there were attacks on the Social Democrats, which also faded into attacks on democracy, on social democracy. So the idea that the machinery of democracy will be overtaken and subverted had already taken place, in fact. I'll come back to that. And also I'll come back to the nationalism as well, of course. But the third item took me by surprise. Maybe historians among us and others more sophisticated than me in thinking about this will be able to predict what it was. But the third element was workers' rights. So the important part, the third part of the program was workers' rights. And this is very interesting because you get the same thing in Italian fascism as well. So Mussolini started as a socialist. If you look at the fascists' early programs in Italy, they're offering workers' rights, shortening of the workers' day, equality for women, voting at the age of 18, and so on. So initially, Italian fascism was basically socialism plus extreme nationalism. And when we look at the name of the Nazis in Germany, the National Socialists, most people on the left will tell you that doesn't have anything to do with socialism, it's just a name. But actually, in the foundation of National Socialism, there was certainly very strong appeals to the workers. Idea that, for example, war profits would be confiscated, that unearned income would be removed. A lot of this, in fact, of course, is coding for anti-Semitism. But if you take the platform at face value, it looks like a socialist platform with nationalism added on. Now, none of that, of course, was realized. So it was propaganda. But to make any progress, Hitler had to appeal to the ordinary worker. It wasn't an elite movement, at least not to begin with. So Lorimer sees these three aspects as the critical part, the driving force of Nazism. Workers' rights. So I've already mentioned Mussolini, votes for women, progressive tax, 8-hour day, Hitler, early program. So that, I think, is in place. As I've said, those promises were never cashed in. So those promises were made, but they were ignored later on. Nationalism, by contrast, of course, was there from the start and was accelerated and accelerated and accelerated. So the crude nationalism is something I want to focus on for the next few minutes. What it does is set up this type of dialectic that we see in the work of Carl Schmitt that says politics is about friends and enemies. So if you read The Concept of the Political by Carl Schmitt, there is a fascinating discussion where he claims that liberalism isn't really a political view, because liberalism, to put it crudely, wants to be everyone's friend. Liberalism wants to everyone on their one side, but that's not what politics. Politics is about dividing your friends from your enemies, supporting your friends, and attacking your enemies. So who are the enemies of the fascists? Well, of course, the Jews and the communists, but also the intellectuals, the universities, the free press. And we see this language of traitors and parasites. So the traitors are the communists and the parasites are the Jews. And what you have set up among this form of nationalism is a notion of purity, that we need to go back to this fictional, pure, earlier national identity and remove those who are not part of it. Now, in the UK, of course, we never had anything that took on in the way in which fascism took on in Italy and Germany and elsewhere. But we certainly had our fascist theorists and attempted leaders, of which Oswald Mosley is the best known. And I found a short book by Mosley, very helpful in sort of setting out and seeing some of the fascist thinking in the UK, which I think generalizes more broadly. Mosley wrote a book called Questions and Answers. I think it was 100 questions for fascism. So he sets out the questions and he sets out his answers. And what you see is, again, this very strict demarcation into who are the friends and who are the enemies. He sees, for example, the House of Lords in the UK as potentially a friend, but if the House of Lords starts opposing what they want to do, then it's standing in the way of the will of the people and needs to be replaced by an appointed body. The press are fine as long as they're saying the right things. And if they start saying the wrong things, then they're going to be censored. If they start giving the voice to the opposing position, then they have to be silenced or changed. And again, you get the dehumanization. Mosley says that he's not going to attack the Jews as long as they're not traitors. They will be treated like all foreigners. So again, you see this idea, we've got the native-born British and we have the foreigners. So if you're Jewish in England, even if you've been there for generations, you are a foreigner and you will lose your rights. So as long as you're not a traitor, as long as you are not a profiteer, as long as you behave yourself, you can stay, but you are here as a matter of privilege rather than a right, and that can disappear. So the fascists will other those that they oppose, dehumanize. You see the language of swarms, floods of immigrants. The Jews are rats or dogs. And so you get this constant dehumanization. So we see it in Mosley. He tried it in the UK. It didn't work. We had the Battle of Cable Street. My family legend is that my grandfather and his brothers took part in it. I doubt that very much. I think they probably went off as soon as they could. They were in the retail trade. They weren't thugs. But anyway, they claim to have stood up in Cable Street. But you have violence as part of the fascist formation, and interestingly, a type of paramilitary violence. So you have organized violent forces that are not part of the official state. Now, one thing that worries me, and I will come back to this at the end, what happened during the Brexit debacle, I suppose, in the UK, is a lot of people on the left did not want to appeal to any type of nationalist value. That we were globalists, internationalists, cosmopolitans, as we were criticized later, we were citizens of anywhere rather than citizens of somewhere. And we did not want to appeal to national borders or nationalism or anti-immigration or anti-refugee rhetoric. And according to some theorists, those on the elite left who refused to fall into nationalist rhetoric were out of touch with the ordinary people. There's been a movement since then, I'm not quite sure what state it is in at the moment, to try to say, well, what we can do is have something we can call progressive patriotism. So you can have a form of nationalism, but as long as you're pro-union, as long as you're pro-worker, as long as you're pro-poor, that is acceptable. As long as you are still on the left, you can be a nationalist and you will be on the side of the righteous. But you can see what's coming. That is exactly how fascism started, a way of combining, as I said before, socialism and nationalism. So I'm very, very nervous about this movement on the left to try to link progressive values with a form of nationalism. I think there are sources of communal value that the left need to marshal, but to link it too quickly with patriotism or nationalism is very, very dangerous. Okay, so I said Lorimer put forward 3 ideas: workers' rights, crude nationalism, and attacking the Social Democrats, extending to attacking democracy. And what happened with Hitler and what happened with Mussolini and what Mosley explicitly said he would do if he got to power was to use democracy in order to get to power, but once in power to dismantle it. And the reason for that, or at least one justification, is the leaders see themselves as embodying the will of the people. They are the strong men, the strong leaders. And when they're there, they are speaking for the people. So you see this also today, or thankfully not today, but not so long ago with Trump, also with Modi, Bolsonaro, other strong men leaders see themselves as representing the people. And so anyone who stands in their way becomes an enemy of the people, almost by definition. You become an enemy of the people because you're standing in the way of the leader, and the leader is representing the will of the people. So we saw that notoriously in the UK with judges. We saw it in the US with the press. We've seen it in Turkey and India, I think, with the universities. That anyone who is standing up, insisting on people's rights, are seen as not following the will of the people, and therefore are traitors or saboteurs. So early on, when I started doing this work, I started looking for these words, traitors and saboteurs. The idea that anyone who is opposing the government of the day is a traitor or a saboteur. And this goes back to something I remember reading almost 40 years ago, maybe 40 years ago, as an undergraduate, when I was studying political philosophy, and I read about Thomas Hobbes. And Hobbes, of course, argues for the absolute sovereign with unlimited power. And I was reading a source, I haven't been able to trace this source again, but it was someone who was writing in the 1920s, I think. And he said Hobbes's problem is that he had no concept of the loyal opposition. And so that idea of the loyal opposition has stuck in my head ever since. And thinking this is what democracy, democratic politics really needs to understand. The loyal opposition is opposition to the party in power, but not opposition to the system. And what these strongmen leaders do is deliberately blur that boundary. So if you're opposing their rule, you are opposing the system. Therefore, you are a traitor. Therefore, you are an enemy. Therefore, you are a saboteur. So who is going to tell you what the will of the people is? Now, there is a fascinating argument in one of Hitler's speeches, which he gave to the Dusseldorf industrialists, one of his famous speeches. And this is a speech that went on for hours, I think 2.5 hours. And you can imagine it's a speech in the evening. The Dusseldorf industrialists are drinking probably quite heavily. And there you have Hitler in full charismatic mode, making a whole range of arguments. And then he gets to talking about democracy. And he gives them this argument. Would you have your workers run your factory? He gives the industrialists this rhetorical question. Would you have your workers run your factory? And of course, they all would have laughed and said, of course not, of course not. And so he follows up. So if you wouldn't let them run your factory, why would you let them run your country? And this feels like a very powerful argument. That if the workers are not even competent to run a factory, why should they have any say at all in running the country? Now, you might recognize that argument. It's the same argument that Plato gave in the Republic against democracy, that ruling is a skill and the ordinary people are not equipped to carry that out. So you get this very strong anti-democratic argument that the people are not competent. And I must say, it's a very tempting argument that whenever you lose a vote, whenever your party doesn't win the election, it's very easy to blame the electorate for not being educated enough. Many of us felt this about Brexit. It was too important a decision to leave to the people. But then what decisions should you leave to the people, if not that one? So you have this elitist, skills-based, leave the ruling to the experts argument that really disempowers democracy. So you have this right-wing argument, but also a left-wing argument, any authoritarian argument that says we know best and the people, yes, the people can put us in power, but once they're there, their work is done and they need to leave things to us. In response, I think it's very important to have a much richer understanding of democracy. The democracy is not just about voting in elections. The democracy is also about the protection of minority rights, or at least liberal democracy is also about the protection of minority rights. And to do that, we need not just voting, but a whole range of institutions. So I've mentioned the free press, I've mentioned universities, I've mentioned the House of Lords. I would also add, of course, trade unions, but also the institutions of civil society. So clubs, art, religion, civil society, businesses where people can earn their living away from the state. One of the things that was very memorable about the Soviet Union and the Soviet satellites was how they really could not accept a sector of the civil society where people could organize themselves without the state having a say in it. So the idea that people, so I have worked in philosophy departments most of my life. There was a very famous organization in Czechoslovakia, which was just a group of citizens who wanted to get together to discuss Greek philosophy, nothing else. It wasn't political protest, it was just a hobby group of people to discuss Greek philosophy. And they kept getting arrested because no one would believe that all they wanted to do was discuss Greek philosophy. It must have been a front for something else. And this became very famous because a lot of British philosophers went out to talk to this group as a way of trying to protest the regime and to support that aspect of civil society. So I think that to preserve liberal democracy, we have to think about a whole tissue and complex of checks and balances which act as a limit on the ruler's power, which will frustrate the ruler because I think it was reported Trump got very frustrated. He thought when he was president, he should be able to do whatever he wanted. Isn't that what a president can do? Well, no, there are lots of procedures you have to go through, lots of people you need to persuade, lots of people that are going to stand in your way. And that is what we need. So let me sum up. I've talked mostly about fascism in the 30s. I've tried to bring in some parallels for the present day. Where do I think we are? Well, I don't think we're on the verge of fascism today. I think we have authoritarian strong leaders. We have a number of worrying signs, but I don't think, I think it would be alarmist and irresponsible to say we're on the verge of what we saw in Germany in the late 1930s. But there are danger signs. There's certainly rising authoritarianism. There is disenfranchisement of many of the aspects of civil society. There's a rise of, or there was a rise of left nationalism. I'm not sure what's happening to that. But it seems to me very, very important that we get beyond thinking of friends and enemies, whoever we are, that we need to think that other people are citizens. We may have disagreements with them. We need to be drawn into dialogue with them. As soon as we think of others as enemies, we will be sliding into a situation which it will be very hard to recover. So this is really my plea, not an argument, a plea for restoration of the institutions of liberal democracy. But at the same time, I think we do need to understand the power of nationalism and the communitarian roots that it draws on. And the project that I'm hoping to move to is to think about the values that draw people to nationalism, but whether we can exemplify them in ways that are not necessarily nationalistic. So yes, of course, for many people, their nation is important to them, but also so is their religion, and that will be cosmopolitan rather than national. So are their interests, so are their local community. So I would want to put allegiance to nation as one allegiance among many, and for most people, not a particularly important one most of the time, although during the Olympics, perhaps it's more important than other times. So I think I'm on my 30 minutes there, so I will stop and look forward to your comments and questions a little later on. So thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Joe. Thank you for your contribution. So we'll let Steve Ross speak, and then we'll have a Q&A for both of you afterwards. So Steve is going to speak. The title of his talk is "The War Against Hate: American Jewish Resistance to Anti-Semitism and White Supremacy After 1945." So Steve, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you. I'm going to, let's see, do a screen share and get, there we go. 1 second, let's see. Now let's do a screen share. There we go. I assume everyone can see the slideshow. Is this yes?
Yes.
It's good.
Okay. So on January 6th, 2021, Americans, and in fact, much of the world was shocked as they watched tens of thousands of self-proclaimed patriots storm the Capitol. And many blamed Donald Trump for promoting the hate-filled day, but he was not solely to blame, nor is hate going to end when he leaves the office. What the nation witnessed on that cold winter afternoon was bigger than any one person. In fact, I argue it goes back to 1945, when Americans began fighting a second world war over the vision of the future, and they've continued to fight it ever since. Groups such as the Proud Boys, the Aryan Nation, Oath Keepers, and associated militias all saw themselves as Christian patriots protecting the Constitution from the perversions of liberals and the left, in the same way white supremacists sought to save America from similar threats after 1945. Well, Americans today like to believe that the end of World War II brought a decrease in hate and a new era of tolerance for the United States, and I would suggest nothing could be further from the truth. Anti-Semitism and racism went up, not down after the war. According to 14 public opinion polls in 1945, 25% of Americans were, quote, infected with anti-Semitism, 25% were opposed to anti-Semitism, and 50% had no opinion. Now, no poll ever asked someone, are you a racist? But in 1945, in September, when people were asked if they would favor a law requiring employers to hire a person qualified for a job, regardless of race, 43% of Americans said, yeah, it's a good idea. 44% said no, and 13% had no opinion. Well, these grim statistics, combined with outbreaks of racial and anti-Semitic violence throughout the 1940s and 50s, require us to reconsider the legacy of the so-called good war and greatest generation. Well, as soon as World War II ended, a new battle began on American soil, and it's one that's lasted to today. Many veterans returned home profoundly changed by their wartime experiences, not just by the traumas of combat, but by the close relationships they forged with men of their platoon, men of different religions, ethnicities, regions, and class backgrounds, people they would have been unlikely to befriend during peacetime. And many longstanding prejudice slowly dissipated as they came to see, quote, others, that is Jews, Blacks, Catholics, Latinos, as sharing the same basic values, even if some of those others fought in segregated units. And many of these veterans returned home with a greater sense of why defeating Hitler had been so important to democracy and the nation's future. And these are the people who Tom Brokaw and others hailed as the greatest generation. But there was also a darker side to the war's end that we almost never talk about. Many Americans went off to war not because they hated Hitler and Nazism, but simply because Japan had attacked the United States, and they did not like Jews before and blacks before the war, and they certainly didn't like them after the war. And these veterans had been raised in a climate of segregation, racism, and anti-Semitism, and they returned home from war determined to maintain the world they had left behind. Many of those veterans, particularly coming from the South and the Southwest, felt betrayed by their country. They had served the nation in war, but when they returned home, they were told by outsiders that the world they left could no longer be, that there was a new, more democratic order that no longer promoted white supremacy. Well, following war's end, undercover spy John Roy Carlson attended meetings of so-called patriotic groups in cities across the nation. And Carlson reported how, quote, many Americans who truly love their country are innocently drawn within these orbits of those who, under the guise of Christianity, nationalism, and America first, incite hate and disunity and wish to preserve the Constitution by means identical with Hitler. Nationalism, he noted, can mean patriotic devotion to one's country, and amongst decent Americans it still does. But America's hate mongers and saboteurs, he wrote, call themselves nationalists to deceive the unwary. And these extreme nationalist movements stand for the same poisonous brand of autocratic, minority-hating politics known in Hitler's Germany and Mussolini's Italy as fascism. This was written in 1946. Well, this was the legacy left by the fathers and grandfathers of contemporary hate groups. Their sons, daughters, grandsons, granddaughters could be seen saving America once again by storming the Capitol on January 6, 2021. The US war in Europe lasted 4 years, but the domestic hate has persisted until today. Well, to understand how this came to be, the book I'm currently writing, The War Against Hate, American Resistance to White Supremacy after 1945, follows 4 men who influenced the course of hate in post-World War II. Starting in 1946, Emory Burke, Jesse B. Stoner, James Maydall, and later on George Lincoln Rockwell led a war of hate that promised to finish the job that Hitler began. In fact, Stoner and Rockwell are revered today by many of the current militias and hate groups as godfathers of white supremacy. These 4 men and the groups that they formed were opposed by 3 New York-based groups, the Anti-Defamation League, the American Jewish Committee, and the Non-Sectarian Anti-Nazi League, and the dozens of undercover operatives who monitored and undermined the deadly efforts of these groups. From 1945 through the late 1970s, and in the case of the Anti-Defamation League, to this very moment today, these 3 groups ran secret undercover operations to protect Blacks and Jews from harm. Because in America, Blacks and Jews knew they couldn't rely on the FBI for protection. Director J. Edgar Hoover displayed little concern for the rapid growth of American-based Nazi and fascist organizations before and during the war, preferring instead to focus his resources on investigating alleged communists. Consequently, it would be up to the leaders of these 3 New York groups to protect Jews and Blacks from harm. Well, the first post-war group is the Colombians, and with their appearance in 1946, terror returned to the South and especially to Atlanta, the Munich of post-war America. Imagine if the Ku Klux Klan and the Nazi-inspired German-American Bund were to have an offspring, it would look exactly like the Colombians. As most Americans prepared for post-war peace, Colombian founder Homer Loomis Jr. and Emory Burke proposed fighting a new war. As Loomis wrote, what Germans have done to the Jews will be a mere tea party, compared to what we're going to do with them. We lost the war in Europe, but we're going to win the war at home. Chartered in August 1946 as a patriotic political group, the Colombians set out to establish themselves as the nation's leading white supremacists. Loomis and Burke envisioned a 2-part strategy. They would create a climate of terror amongst Blacks and Jews. They would organize a new political party that would pass measures expelling Jews and Blacks from America. And they believed this was no pipe dream because they quickly established alliances with like-minded racial purity groups in Minneapolis, Indianapolis, Chattanooga, Jacksonville, Washington, Los Angeles, Philadelphia, New York, and Milwaukee. Loomis and Burke were preparing for war by assembling a arsenal of rifles, machine guns, and dynamite. And their first attack came on October 1946, when Ralph Childers beat Black teenager Clifford Hines for the crime of walking through a white neighborhood. 3 days later, the Colombians bombed the home of Mr. and Mrs. Frank Jones, who committed the unpardonable sin of moving into the city's all-white working-class West End neighborhood. These bombings signaled the Colombians' determination to remove Blacks and Jews from the United States. Well, after hearing about what the group was doing, the head of the Anti-Nazi League, James Sheldon, struck a deal with Southern-born journalist Stetson Kennedy. And in return for joining the Colombians and spying on the Klan and sending him reports, Sheldon promised to pay him $50 a week, which is almost $700 today. No lone warrior, Sheldon shared Kennedy's reports with Georgia's crusading Attorney General Daniel Duke, who in turn turned all the information over to the governor and Attorney General's office. Well, Sheldon sent in two experienced operatives to break up the group, Mario Buzzi and Renee Fruchtbaum. Arriving in Atlanta in early November 1946, Buzzi introduced himself to Burke as Mario Falco, an Italian fascist who had come to Atlanta hoping to organize the city's Italians into an anti-Semitic organization. Burke welcomed the newcomer and was especially delighted when Mario introduced his attractive comrade, Renee Forrest, whose real name was Fruchtbaum, who offered to work as Loomis's personal secretary. What the two fascist leaders didn't suspect was that Fruchtbaum spent her evenings photographing their records on a camera disguised as a cigarette lighter. Sheldon then sent the documents to Dan Duke and as Georgia's Attorney General, Eugene Cook. In February 1947, armed with over 200 pages of evidence provided by the two spies, Duke secured guilty verdicts against the Colombian leaders, both of whom were sentenced to 3 years in jail, and the Colombians fell apart. The problem, as we see with post-war hate groups, is the moment one declines, another rises up. And the collapse of the Colombians presented an opportunity for Jesse Stoner and his Christian anti-Jewish party. The Clearingist Party, 100% for white supremacy, the former Colombian and Klan leader called for every Black man, woman, and child to be deported to Africa and for all Jews to be exterminated immediately. His incentive for action was alluring. When Jews were dead, American Christians would share their money and become wealthy beyond their wildest dream. Well, a childhood battle with polio left Stoner with a lifelong limp and a chip on both shoulders. In late 1946, the white supremacist who the Klan expelled for being too radical founded the Stoner Anti-Jewish Party. 2 years later, he ran for Congress on a platform that would make Judaism a crime punishable by death. In 1952, aided by former Colombian strongman Edward Fields, Stoner's party promised to modernize the mass killing of Jews by employing gas chambers, electric chairs, firing squads, or quote, whatever else seemed appropriate. Once in power, Stoner promised he would amend the Constitution so that only white Gentiles would be allowed to live in America. And again, Southerners were attracted by the party's longstanding mantra, quote, when the Jews are gone, the Americans will own rich America. Well, the three New York groups sent undercover agents south to gather information, which they did and in turn sent to government authorities and media outlets. That information led to the party's demise, but not Stoner. Over the next decade, he extended his campaign of hate beyond the South, and along with Emory Burke, Edward Field, and several other Colombians, they traveled to New York City in the early 50s to support the man who considered himself the next great American Führer, James Maydol. Well, most Americans are familiar with Southern hate groups like the Ku Klux Klan, but few know that New York City was the epicenter of post-war Nazi movement in America, and that James Madoll hoped to head an international alliance of fascist groups powerful enough to unseat democratic governments throughout the world. What Hitler accomplished in Europe, he promised, his National Renaissance Party will accomplish in America. Well, in 1949, declaring that America needed to be saved from the Jewish menace, the prematurely balding 22-year-old founded the National Renaissance Party, an avowedly anti-Semitic, anti-Nazi organization, anti-Semitic, anti-Negro organization. And from then until his death in May 1979, he held weekly meetings at his residence and near weekly rallies in the heavily pro-Nazi Yorkville neighborhood in the East 80s of Manhattan. Madoll's 9-point program of racial nationalism called for the deportation of those racial elements which cannot be assimilated with the white race, Puerto Ricans, Negroes, and Asiatics, a term he used to describe Jews. And although the National Renaissance Party's membership never totaled more than a few hundred, his National Renaissance Bulletin attracted right-wing leaders throughout the world. You want to think of this in a sense as the Facebook or Twitter of its time. Extremists throughout the world used this as the central vehicle for exchanging information about national and international developments in the worlds of hate. Well, determined to thwart one of the greatest dangers of our time, James Sheldon sent in a slew of anti-Nazi League spies with one mission: join the National Renaissance Party, rise to positions of leadership, and foil any potential violence. Within a short time, 4 of his agents succeeded in penetrating Madoll's inner circle of hate. In May 1953, Army veteran Emmanuel Trujillo was walking near 86th Street and Lexington Avenue when he heard the loud voice of a pudgy man surrounded by a group of tough-looking men in stormtrooper uniforms. The speaker exhorted the crowd to rid the Jewish and Black menace of our country. And Trujillo saw them hiling Hitler and Senator Joe McCarthy, and then heard the speaker say it's, quote, okay to kill Jews and Negroes as they're communists anyway. After observing a New York police officer congratulate Madoll for his excellent speech, the Army veteran decided to do what he could to oppose the Nazis. Trujillo was just one of many unsung heroes who took it upon themselves to destroy fascism in America. Born in 1946 to an unwed teen mother and a World War I veteran, he was given up for adoption and raised in Phillipsburg, New Jersey. In 1942, the 16-year-old ran away from home and joined the Royal Merchant Marines. And 2 years later, he transferred to the US Army Rangers, where he spent the last months of the war fighting in Germany. After an honorable discharge, he went to New York and finished his education at the Jefferson School of Social Science, which was a communist-inspired organization, and he was learning more about Nazism and fascism. What he heard that May afternoon shook the veteran to his core. Quote, I was not too sure what I was fighting for during the war, but after listening to Madoll, he understood that the National Renaissance Party stands for everything that I and a lot of men fought in World War II to stop. We can't just sit back and let the liberty of our Constitution go to hell. Well, knowing he couldn't undermine the Nazis on his own, Trujillo approached James Sheldon and offered to spy for the anti-Nazi League. Sheldon agreed. After Trujillo proved himself a fearless fighter in several fistfights, Madoll asked him to join their inner circle of stormtroopers, known as the Elite Guard. Well, Trujillo, who took the assumed name of Mana Trujillo, quickly moved up in the National Renaissance hierarchy. And, excuse me, he was but worried that what would happen if his true mission was discovered. As he wrote Sheldon, these Nazis are bastards. If they ever find out who and what I am, it'll be too bad. Sheldon responded by sending in 3 more spies to help. Irene Duval, who assumed the name of Ruth Ross and served as Trujillo's chief assistant, Larry Sestito, an American representative to the Italian Fascist Party in New York, and John Langrod, who posed as a college student interested in learning more about their program. Well, despite warnings from J.B. Stoner and Emery Burke to beware of the Jewish spies from New York, Maydol was enamored with Trujillo, especially after he discovered he was fluent in German. Maydol quickly appointed him director, the most important position in their group is director of overseas operation, and asked Trujillo to be their chief correspondent with Nazis and fascists throughout the world. His goal was to unite all his allies at home and abroad into a single powerful fascist international organization. Well, like many escaped Nazi leaders, many throughout the world, like Einar Aberg, corresponded with Maydol and passed information in his letter section asking for money and weapons. Well, Maydol quickly rose up within the world's hierarchy, and by Christmas 1953, he was celebrating his success. His followers were turning out in greater numbers. He had established National Renaissance branches in cities across the country, and his party seemed to be going off into the realm of politics. Indeed, he recruited fascist H. Keith Thompson to run for Congress on the National Renaissance Party ticket. Maydol's dreams of becoming the American Adolf Hitler finally seemed to be coming true, and then everything collapsed. Well, one problem the three groups faced is that they often failed to share their findings. And anti-defamation spy Sandy Griffith had been tailing Trujillo for months without knowing he worked for Sheldon. And when Trujillo approached the ADL offering to share information with them, they thought they were being set up by a communist group. And so they exposed him as a communist spy in their 1953 ADL bulletin. Well, Maydol refused to believe the article and accused the ADL of trying to split his ranks. But in fact, it was true. The exposure of Maydol's spies and the backlash from his supporters sent the National Renaissance Party into a temporary period of decline. But there would be no rest for Sheldon, the ADL, or the American Jewish Committee, for two new threats emerged: a series of synagogue bombings and church bombings, and the founding of George Lincoln Rockwell's American Nazi Party. Well, at 3:30 a.m. on October 12, 1958, a bomb went off, destroying much of Atlanta's Hebrew Benevolent Congregation Temple. Only one man was arrested, George Bright. The 34-year-old engineer and Army demolition veteran was set free after a jury deadlocked 9-3 in favor of conviction. As one of the three voting to acquit explained to the press, "You can't send a man to penitentiary for life just because he's a Jew hater." The Atlanta Temple bombing was one of more than nearly 24 synagogue and church bombings during the 1950s, many in response to the Supreme Court's Brown versus Board of Education decision. Bright, who had joined the Columbians in 1946, was carrying out the lessons he learned from Emery Burke, Homer Loomis Jr., J.B. Stoner, and Edward Fields. If Jews came to the aid of Blacks, they could expect the same treatment: terror and death. During a 9-week period beginning at Christmas 1959, over 600 synagogues, Jewish schools, residences, and shops throughout the country were targeted for vandalism or destruction. The ADL and the Anti-Nazi League responded to repeated attacks on Jews by stepping up their spy operation. ADL spy master Arnold Foster placed undercover agents in the Southern Citizens Councils and a number of anti-Jewish groups throughout the country. And when agents discovered Klan plans for violence, they notified Foster, who in turn notified local authorities. And in one instance, information from the ADL's Miami head, B. Botnick, led to the arrest of several Klan bombers. Determined to crush the NRP, James Sheldon replaced his original 4 now discredited spies with John Rich and William Goring, a Columbia undergraduate who Maydol was training as a successor. Well, spies from the 3 groups slowed down the bombing, but they soon faced a new threat, the formation of the National States Right Party in 1958 by J.B. Stoner protege, James Maydol ally, Edward Fields, and the launching of the American Nazi Party in 1959. Well, George Lincoln Rockwell's flair for the dramatic attracted a cadre of former military personnel, young toughs, and longtime haters searching for leaders who reflected their ideas. Born in Bloomington, Illinois in 1918, Rockwell enlisted in the Naval Air Corps in March 1941 and served until October 45 when he was demobilized with the rank of lieutenant commander. And he returned to active duty in 1950 to train fighter pilots for the Korean War. But a year later, he had a conversion experience while reading Mein Kampf. As he explained, I was transfixed, hypnotized. I realized that National Socialism, the iconoclastic worldview of Adolf Hitler, was the doctrine of scientific racial idealism, actually a new religion. In 1958, determined to carry out Hitler's teachings, the Navy veteran joined J.B. Stoner, Edward Fields, Columbian co-founder Emory Burke, and 100 delegates from 18 states to form the National States Rights Party. In 1959, Rockwell founded the American Nazi Party with headquarters in Arlington, Virginia. And he gained national attention by always appearing in Nazi uniform, surrounding himself with stormtroopers and swastika flags. Well, Rockwell adopted a platform taking directly from the Columbians and Stoner's anti-Jewish party. He would exterminate all Jews and send American blacks to Africa. After undercover agents alerted Sheldon and Foster to the bitter rivalry between Maydol and Rockwell, they urged the spies to widen that division until one of the two groups collapsed. Well, Rockwell succeeded in recruiting members of Maydol's inner circle, but his victory had one fatal flaw. Several of the men he recruited were working for the Anti-Nazi League or the Anti-Defamation League. Well, Maydol and Rockwell soon realized that their organizations had been penetrated by the Jews. And this time the spy masters as well as the spies were targeted for death. Anti-Nazi League agent John Rich warned Sheldon to be, quote, on guard, for Rockwell says he would like to cut up one of the ADL people and send his body in a box to the ADL offices. The Nazis knew the Jews were spying on them, and paranoia on the right grew so intense that Rockwell warned Maydol, the word is going around that he was an ADL agent being paid 30 grand for his inside information.
Excuse me,
Well,
Steve.
dissension between
Steve,
the two
sorry
leaders-
to interrupt. Sorry to interrupt you. Can you please finish in about 4 minutes or so?
Sure.
Thank you.
Dissension between the two leaders led Maydol's most devoted followers to splinter into two groups. But the unfortunate for the Nazis, those groups collapsed after John Patler assassinated Rockwell, and David Burroughs, his number 2 man, committed suicide after he was exposed in the New York Times as being the son of an Orthodox Jew. Following Maydol's assassination, Rockwell's assassination, Maydol emerged as the leader of the new group. But Maydol's dream of becoming the American Hitler ended on April 28, 1971, when a disgruntled right-wing activist smashed him in the head with a brick. Maydol never recovered, and by the summer of 1971, the FBI discontinued surveillance of the National Renaissance Party, insisting it no longer posed a threat. And as we see here, at one point, the Rockwell as well as Maydol forged alliance with Black nationalists who both believed in race separation, and they held joint meetings with Blacks on one side of the room and whites on the other. Well, when the Unite the Right held a white supremacist rally of neo-Nazi groups in Charlottesville in 2017, Americans were shocked by their chants, the Jews will not replace us. And shock turned to horror as anti-Semitic attacks grew more deadly over the next several years. From the attacks in Pittsburgh that killed 11 to the Chabad congregation shootings that left 1 dead. And many asked, how could this have happened? They should not have been surprised. These shootings are part of a long-standing battle that stretches back to the end of World War II, when soldiers returned with two radically different visions of the nation's future and were willing to kill for them. The story I tell in The War Against Hate ends in the late 70s, but Nazis and Klansmen persist to today. And one of the keys to understanding this persistence of hate is the fact that so many hate group leaders served their apprenticeship with one of the groups that I've mentioned. And in fact, a very current book talked about how Jesse Stoner is still revered amongst at least 99 fascist groups in the United States today. In the last interview he gave, an unrepentant Stoner insisted, "If I was still active, I'd be the same, defending white people against race mixing, no matter what the cost." Well, the Anti-Nazi League, the Anti-Defamation League, and the American Jewish Committee, and the men and women who risked their lives running undercover operations understood one thing: democracy requires constant vigilance. The citizen spies who worked for them were almost all white and Christian, and yet they never saw themselves as protecting Jews or Blacks. They saw themselves as protecting their fellow Americans. Theirs is a story worth telling over and over again. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Steve. Thank you. So interesting. I think the two speakers, Joe and Steve, are looking at, I guess, the lure of fascism and the history of fascism in the West, and looking at it from different perspectives, but pointing to a legacy that is very much part of our history and perhaps points to similarities and differences in the current situation. So what I would like to ask the first question very briefly to Joe. You can hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay, great. Okay, good. So, Joe, you were saying that the enemies of fascism were so Jews and communists and the universities. And I was wondering, I want to push back a little bit. I know that the universities in Nazi Germany were the only institution in society that voluntarily gave up its students and its faculty and removed Jews from universities. And bringing this to the contemporary context, I think many of the scholars that are dealing with contemporary anti-Semitism, we had a session today with Dave Rich and David Hirsch. And I think unlike other forms of hatred, there's this tendency for scholars who are doing work on contemporary anti-Semitism that our research is often dismissed as being advocacy for Israel or being instrumental to defend the Jewish community, but it's not serious scholarship, and it's sort of dismissed. And this is sort of happening on the radical left, let's say, and I think to some extent within the university system. So is this an indication, in a way, you were speaking about, you have a sort of a bleak prediction, I guess, of the future, or sort of teetering on sort of a fascistic moment. Is this also another indication that there's sort of this red-green alliance, we call it in the study of anti-Semitism, of sort of the radical intellectual left in the West, kind of receiving funding from the Muslim Brotherhood in universities and sort of identifying with the victims of Hamas? Is there something going on in the universities that is of concern from your perspective?
Okay, thank you, John. So first of all, going back to the Nazi era, I had very little time. I should have distinguished the universities from the people in the universities. And so if you think about the incredible exodus from the universities in Austria and Germany, I had this fantasy of doing a study about what American academia owed to the exodus of socialists and Jews from Germany and Austria. But what I realized is that it's everything. So there isn't a study to be done more or less in my own subject, philosophy. It's just amazing to think what the global intellectual landscape would be like now if there hadn't been such a mass migration from Europe to America. In terms of radical alliances on universities. Now, all I can say is I don't have any experience of it. I'm not saying it doesn't happen, but it's not something that has come onto my radar. So I think I just need to leave that to people who are better qualified to speak than me.
Okay, so thank you, Joe. And Steve, sort of from a similar perspective, but to your area of your presentation, in the contemporary context, the rift between the American Jewish and African American communities is substantial. You spoke to a point in history where there was cooperation and sympathies with elements of both the Jewish American and African American communities. Given the rift and given the discourse of elements, not all, but elements of some of the leadership of Black Lives Matter, and this sort of emerging notion that Jews are white, elitists, and racist, and supporting an apartheid system, that's sort of the rhetoric of the so-called radical left and some in the Black Lives Matter. How do you see this rift will continue to, will the schism continue to grow, or do you think there's efforts that will try to bring the two communities together as racism and anti-Semitism in the United States is increasing?
Well, there are already efforts to try to bring them together. You've had a lot of, and particularly I find it interesting in the sports world, you've had people like Kareem Abdul-Jabbar and a number of others trying to remind African-American colleagues that in fact Jews, first of all, Jews and Blacks have been allies for years. And secondly, regardless of previous history, when one minority group is attacked, all minority groups are attacked. And that rather than minority groups splitting and opposing one another, they need to be forming an alliance against those who are real enemies. And so it really is a matter of education. But right now, I'm not sure how long it's going to take to heal that rift. And part of it is that a lot of BLM leaders don't actually understand the history of movement politics from the 1930s to today. And I think if they did, that would be one way to begin to change their point of view. And for example, when I talk to students and we talk about white privilege, I ask them, what color am I? And they look at me like I'm out of my mind. And I say, well, if this was 1920, what color would I be? Would it be the same? And I begin to tell them about the color line and that Jews, in fact, were not considered white. And basically all the groups I've talked about today said Jews are not white, they're Asiatics. So I'm not sure how, this is a very painful, I think, for those of us who have been active in movement politics, it's very painful to see what's going on today.
Yeah. Okay, thank you, both of you. So we have a bunch of questions. The first question, Noreen Rahim, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. I have a very short question to Mr. Jonathan, and that is, can we concretely define or categorize the activities of anti-Semitism as a political crime at large?
As a political crime? Yeah, well, it's a good question, but I fear I'm not the person to answer that question. It's not been part of my research to think about crimes, and the idea of a political crime, I don't have a clear sense of what you're getting at. Is there a particular definition of political crime that you have in mind?
Well, if we look into the fascism, it mostly relates to the political movements and other activities related to it. So we have seen in the previous sessions in this training that anti-Semitism is defined and also is seen in the public at large with the very different, various types of nature. So I was wondering if, since we can call the genocide as a political crime to some extent, as the genocide scholars have already argued, but in terms of anti-Semitic activities that's going on as the recent trends in different parts of the world, so can we actually categorize it as the nature of a political crime or not?
Okay, I understand better now. Thank you. So I think, as you say, anti-Semitism comes in many forms, and I think certainly there will be some forms that are a political crime. but I would hesitate myself before saying all forms. I think there's casual everyday anti-Semitism, which is morally very bad. Whether we want to call it a crime is another matter. So I think one thing to bear in mind is not all bad things are crimes, that there are ways of being, if you break a promise to a friend, for example, that's a bad thing, but it's not a crime. So we just need to be careful that we don't lump everything together. I think there are very, very serious forms of anti-Semitism, which are definitely legal crimes and political crimes, but I would just be slightly cautious before saying everything falls into that category.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks for the question. Chris, the floor is yours.
Okay, I have actually just 2 comments to Jonathan. Basically, that Hitler was clearly a socialist in the beginning. If you look at the 25 points program of the Nazi party, there were some points where he had to answer some very inconvenient questions by industrialists later on, because that, among other things, it actually says the nationalization of industries, etc., that are communist, socialist, let's say, demands, etc. That's only on the side. By the way, if I would have had Hitler in my class, I would have given him an F for plagiarism, because there's nothing original about Nazism, absolutely nothing. Then to Stephen, I said this also in my talk, in the ISGAP talk about German resistance against the Nazis. Both Roosevelt and Churchill knew exactly about Auschwitz, about the exact details, what was going on back there, by the German resistance that informed them in various operations in Sweden, in Switzerland, and in Spain. They were clearly informed what was going on. And they were told, please bomb the railroad tracks, and nothing happened. So in terms of anti-Semitism, think what that tells you. And also a last comment, remember the story about the ship, the St. Louis, that arrived in Florida, that was turned away by the American authorities because the guy in charge was an anti-Semite. And these people ended all up in Auschwitz and all were killed by the Nazis. Yeah, I mean, that tells you a lot about, let's say, racism and things in the United States. Not to talk about the yellow peril in the 19th century, the internment of the Japanese Americans, and I mean, you can go on and on and on like this. Thanks. That's all what I just want to say.
If I can just respond briefly, so I completely agree with you about the early program, and I've quoted that myself in some work. But it also strikes me, I don't know if you agree, whether Hitler just said whatever would make him popular with the audience in front of him. So I think he said different things to different people, and these days with instant media, you'd pick that up, but there was no one listening, no one comparing, or no one had an interest in exposing him. So anyway, I agree with that. And on the plagiarism point, absolutely. I accept that too. So thank you.
Steve, any comment?
Yeah.
No, okay. Thank you. So Ruben and then Matthew.
Yes, thank you, and thank you to both speakers. I have a question to Professor Wolff. You mentioned the concept of loyal opposition, and in relation to that, you mentioned a few political actors like Trump and Bolsonaro and Modi. Probably examples we can all agree on. Now, following the question by Dr. Small, we have talked a lot about the discourse of the quote-unquote academic left and how it can be characterized by dichotomy between the oppressed and the oppressor, and how this may lead to a new form of bon ton anti-Semitism in the form of criticism of Israeli apartheid and anti-colonialism. Now, my question is, and I hope this question makes sense, can we think about the concept of loyal opposition in the public sphere and in this public debate that may now be characterized in terms of oppressor and oppressed? And if we can, how can we plea for a defense of this loyal opposition in public debate?
Yeah, So I think this is really important, and irrespective of the example you use, if something comes up, and I think social media has made this really much worse. So in my job as an academic in a school of government, I made it my business for a long time to try to follow on social media people from right across the political spectrum. But after a while, I had to stop because it upset me too much. And I would see a tweet from some rabid person I greatly disagreed with, and it would feel like an electric shock going through my body. You read these things, and you expect to maybe be a bit challenged, but to be insulted to the level you are. And so what seems to me to have happened in politics over the last 10, 15 years, maybe longer, accelerated by social media, is just the civility has gone out of it. The idea that you can disagree with people's ideas, but not attack them personally. And I think we've lost also something we try to teach students as undergraduates, this idea of depersonalizing arguments. Listen to the argument, listen to the reason. Don't attack the person who gave it. Don't always suspect their motives. But at this point, we have got ourselves, Schmitt has almost won, that we're back into a position of thinking in terms of friends and enemies, rather than people who are part of a conversation. And this is a type of an old, very English notion of what politics should have been. That in the 1920s and 30s, and maybe up to the 50s, it was a conversation among, of course, in those days, educated men. Now it should be a conversation among everyone, educated or not. But how we restore that, I don't know. And it just gets worse and worse rather than better and better. So if you have any ideas of restoring civility into our debates, then that would go down very well. Except, of course, you'll be shot down immediately if you try, personally attacked if you try to reintroduce civility.
That's very important. We have a thing here at ISGAP called ISGAP only conversations, where the one guiding principle is we have to discuss ideas, we could debate ideas, but we have to respect each other and engage each other. So
absolutely right.
Yeah, that's what universities should be all about in particular. So very important. So Matthew, your question, please.
Sure, thanks, Charles. I guess this question would be for Stephen. Why do you think, or do you think that the threat from the extreme right is being overlooked, particularly in the United States, in light of the Capitol riots, in light of infiltration of right-wing groups into the police forces and in the military, and also the fact that there are paramilitary groups within the United States that are just as well armed as like Hamas or terrorist groups that we've been talking about. And yes, that's my question. And on a personal note, when I go home I'm in Mexico City now, when I go home to New Jersey and I talk to people from my community, it's a rural community, and because I'm white and because I am Catholic Christian, the conversations I have with people are absolutely frightening, especially when we talk about extreme right-wing ideology. Thank you.
Well, I would argue that part of this goes back to Americans have never dealt with the Civil War. That we have not dealt with race and the question of race and class in America since 1865. We had a moment then to change things. We had a moment again to change things in 1945. And I would argue we have a moment to change it today, but we've constantly avoided dealing with that. And what I think the conversations you're hearing and the frightening parts of America today, one of the things I've tried to do in the new project I'm working on is to try to understand what motivates these people. And here's what I will tell you. The common discourse is you need to understand everyone here in ISGAP, you are the enemy. You're the traitors to America. That it's about they see themselves, these right-wing groups, see themselves as the true patriots. They are, first of all, they believe in Christ. They believe in a white Christian nation. And they believe everyone else, that Jews, blacks, minorities could live here if they know their place. And their place is always being quiet behind a white Christian America. And they are, in fact, the true patriots. And those on the left who oppose them are, in fact, they don't understand true patriotism. They don't love America. They don't understand America. So when you have a side that we see as, quote, right wing, filled with hate, who in fact see themselves not filled with hate, but with patriotism, trying to save America, we've got a real problem. And I'm not sure how, I wish I knew, but I'm not sure how to solve that, other than to get people to understand that these are not crazy people. These are not deplorables. These are a big core of America, and they are not going away. And I will bet that they're going to be powerful enough to take over the House again in 2 years.
Thank you.
Thank you. It's a very important issue. And actually tomorrow, Joel Finkelstein from the NCRI and Princeton University is doing fascinating work using artificial intelligence to measure the radicalization of white extremists in the United States. And you'll see how quickly people are becoming radicalized on social media. So his work is extraordinary on these issues, and you'll see the gravity of the problems we face. Okay, Sami Apple.
Yes, Professor Wolff, I'm from Latin America, and I see a side of this that may interest you. I don't know if you're already into it or not, and it's indigenous. We have a huge indigenous population in Latin America, from Mexico all the way down, and they are being targeted right now by two groups, nationalists on one side and globalist in the other side. And they're both using Jews to latch onto this indigenous people. They're using Jews as colonialists. And it's only starting. I mean, it's been going on for only a few years, but I think it's something that needs to be watched. And I don't know if it would be part of something you'll be interested in the future. Thank you.
So I was completely unaware of this. I will, I'll take a look at it, and I'll see what I can find. Is there much published in English on it? Unfortunately, I don't have other languages, so that would be a reason why I'm not seeing it.
No, nothing has been published. I mean, it's just something that I am starting to notice during my travels and my back and forth with some people, that all of a sudden these groups pop up and then they disappear. Okay. So I don't know if it's really an actual movement, but it's something to be watched, because the indigenous population in Latin America is huge, and it's a big market for those guys.
Okay, thank you. I'll talk to my colleagues who specialize in the regions and see if it's on their radar. So thank you very much for that point.
Thank you, Sami. Victor, please, the floor is yours.
Oh, yes, I just want to follow what Sami said. In Colombia, we have another issue that took my attention recently. I don't know if you're aware of the the riots movement and all that happened in Colombia like 2 months ago or 1 month ago, I don't remember. So the country was totally assaulted. I couldn't even go out to the streets. It was crazy, and it comes from the left because of the injustice of the right. Yes. But what took my attention was that in the middle of the Colombian protests, where more than, I don't know, 50 people were killed by the police, Twitter banned the former president Uribe, mentor of the current president Duque. Uribe's tweets contained references to a neo-Nazi ideologist who has taught classes in the Colombian army colleges on how to deal with protests. So he uses a method like suppression or something like that. I'm not aware of this. I can provide the links. The Colombian media interviewed him, this Chilean neo-Nazi, in the middle of the protest because they wanted to know what were his, his methods, his ideology, how he trained the army, and things like that. So it was very concerning. There are pictures of him, wearing the swastika and all this. So he's very open he has been very open, a neo-Nazi. So it was crazy. It was crazy for me to see this here in Colombia.
Okay, so thank you for that account. I'm not aware of it myself. It's something else I'll follow up on. So I just thank you for the reference to that.
Okay, cool.
Okay, thank you. Is there anybody else with a question? I see Chris, but you already asked the question. Is there anybody else that would like to chime in before Chris? No? Okay, Chris, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Charles. No, I just wanted to make a last comment to Stephen. I mean, I'm teaching since 25 years American history, and I also teach a specific course on slaves and slavery in the United States. And I mean, if you look at the colonial history also of the United States, or of American colonies, whatever you call them, I mean, the Salem witch hunts and all these things. And then comes for me always the basic question, why did the founding fathers not abolish slavery? Why not? Why? Because many of them were slaveholders. And it was not in their minds to change this, And then it continued basically into the 1820s, 30s, when the cotton boom came, et cetera, et cetera. And then it came to the point that it was irreversible and so forth. So, I mean, the United States has a long, not tradition, but you know what I mean. Let's say a story of this, I hate to call it racism. It's something in that direction, okay? So, yeah, that was my comment, sorry.
Thank you.
No, I
Steve, do you
want
want
to maybe go back for a minute. I was thinking about Chris's last question when you were pointing out the St. Louis, when you were pointing out Roosevelt. I would say historians are looking at the wrong issue there. It's as though it actually does disservice to the big picture, because what we can do is say, well, see, Roosevelt and the State Department were just prejudice, and that's why Jews weren't getting more help. No, the bigger story is what's going on in America. Just remember, anti-Semitism goes up after Pearl Harbor. It goes up after Pearl Harbor, and it goes up after World War II. And the real problem with American history is partly the generational fault of my group. My generation, those of us who grew up in the 60s, when we got to graduate school, we started writing, we knew Germany lost. Germany lost the war. So Russia won the war. And so the Cold War was the big threat. And we started looking at the history of radicalism in terms of communism and anti-communism. And simply, if you look at historiography of the 60s, 70s, 80s, the conservative movement is basically never written about. And it's only later, after Reagan comes in, that suddenly historians say, geez, maybe we should have taken conservatism seriously, and not just conservatism, but the far right. And I'll just leave you all with one thing that just always struck me as unbelievably prescient. Imagine it's April 1945. You're sitting in New York City in the offices of the Anti-Defamation League, the American Jewish Committee, and the Non-Sectarian Anti-Nazi League, the three leaders who run spy operations. I got their papers, and they are all separately writing memos saying when the war ends, the persecution against Jews and Blacks is only going to go up. And that our real fear is not that any one organization like the Klan becomes even more powerful. Our real fear is that all these right-wing groups, all these hate groups, figure out a way to communicate with one another. As long as they are isolated, we can fight every one of them, even the Klan. But if they somehow figure out a way to mass communicate, they are going to form in not just a national, but an international fascist anti-Semitic front that's going to pose a danger to America and the world. And what they've seen came true under the Trump administration, with not that Trump caused any of this, but his use of Twitter changed the ball game. And then if you read about all these, the Proud Boys, all the right-wing militias have been communicating via the internet, via these social groups. That has been the most dramatic change in the last decade. It's what these groups, these Jewish leaders feared in 1945, that if they begin to communicate with one another, they can begin to bond with one another and plan common actions. And that's where we are right now.
So thank you, Steve. Joe, would you like a final comment? As we run out of
Only to say that was very interesting to hear Steve then, and to thank everyone for their comments and contributions. I've learned a lot, so thank you very much.
Thank you, Joe, very much. And Steve, thank you so much as well. And we appreciate your contribution. So we're going to take a 30-minute break. And when we return,